The wind howled through the night, the snow biting at her skin as Maya stumbled through the blizzard. Her breaths came out in sharp, desperate gasps, but there was no shelter in sight. She was freezing on the edge of collapse, and then there he was, Edward Hawthorne, stepping out of his sleek black SUV. His face cold but his eyes sharp. He didn't hesitate. "Get in," he commanded. She had no choice but to obey. As the door slammed shut behind her, the warmth of his mansion engulfed her, but something else was cold, his stare. "Who are you?" he asked. Maya's heart pounded. She was more than just a maid, and she was about to change his life forever, without him even knowing it. Maya sat in the corner of the mansion's vast dining room, her fingers stiff from the cold. The warm air felt too thick, too much for her body to adjust. She tugged at the hem of her worn coat, the one she had worn for far too long, and tried to focus on the sound of the fire crackling in the grand fireplace. She had learned to block out the luxury, to ignore the gold-framed paintings, the crystal chandeliers above. She was used to this, being invisible in a room full of people who would never know her name. She had no intention of staying here. Not after tonight. She had work to do. Her eyes drifted to the silver platter in front of her, the untouched food that someone had placed there for her. She couldn't bring herself to eat. The dinner from the night before had been enough. A simple meal she had grabbed after finishing her shift at the hotel. Her stomach tightened, and the hunger gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside. It wasn't the hunger that kept her awake at night. It was the relentless ache of knowing she was just a shadow in a world that had no room for her. Maya's gaze flickered to the grand clock on the wall. She could hear the ticking, a constant reminder of time slipping away. She wasn't supposed to be here. This life, this world of wealth was a fleeting illusion. It always had been, but she didn't mind. She had lived with less before. She knew what it was like to give everything for someone else and ask for nothing in return. She turned her head as Edward entered the room. His footsteps were silent on the polished marble, but his presence, his sheer presence, filled the space with a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. He was distant, focused, as if she was nothing more than a ghost. And maybe she was. "Can I get you something else?" he asked, his voice as detached as ever. Maya swallowed, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "I'm fine, thank you." She had learned long ago to keep her dignity intact. People often overlooked her, assuming she didn't know how to handle herself, assuming she couldn't see through their false kindness. But Maya had learned something valuable. Most people didn't care about the details. They just wanted to feel good about themselves for a moment. She shifted her weight, feeling the stiffness in her back from hours of standing, from the weight of the unspoken. The job she had taken here, cleaning the halls, making the mansion shine, was only temporary, a means to an end. But the job she had done before in the world where she came from had mattered. She had been someone in that world. She had been respected for her mind, her talent. But no one here cared about that. "I heard you were a financial expert," Edward said, his voice cutting through the silence. Maya didn't look at him. "I used to be." For a second, the room seemed to pause. The air between them shifted. The tension, hidden beneath the surface, was suddenly palpable. Maya felt his gaze on her, searching for something, anything that didn't belong. But she kept her eyes on the fire, refusing to show him the desperation she had buried deep inside. She wasn't ashamed of who she was, of where she came from, but she knew better than to expect anything from someone like him. They didn't want to see her. They wanted to see what they thought she was, a maid, a servant, someone who didn't matter. But Maya wasn't just a maid. She was more than that, and sooner or later Edward would have to realize it. But for now she had nothing to prove. She just needed to survive the night. And maybe, just maybe, things would start to change. She wasn't counting on it, but she still had hope, even if it felt like a distant memory. The mansion loomed ahead, its towering structure almost as cold as the people inside. Edward's world, this opulent, isolating realm, was a far cry from the streets Maya had once walked. The grand chandelier in the foyer sparkled, reflecting off the polished marble floors, But Maya hardly noticed it. She had seen luxury before, though never like this. This wasn't the kind of wealth that offered comfort. It was the kind that made sure you never forgot who was in charge. She stood in the shadows, away from the group of suits and silk dresses mingling by the bar, their laughter sharp and polished. No one acknowledged her. The servers moved in a quiet procession, almost invisible, as they navigated between the high-backed chairs and whispered conversations. Maya's fingers tightened around the tray she carried, the weight of it a constant reminder of her place. Edward stood by the massive windows, his back straight, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the sprawling estate. The world outside was still, nothing moved, but the power inside was palpable, suffocating. The guests gathered around, their voices low, too careful to offend, but too indifferent to care. Edward was the king of this world, and he wore his crown without effort. "It's a good deal," one man said, nodding toward Edward. "I'm confident it'll pay off." Edward's response was a curt nod, but his eyes never left the horizon. To him, it was all a game: money, power, influence. It didn't matter who got trampled along the way, as long as he came out on top. The people who worked for him were just another piece of the machinery. Maya felt the weight of that truth in her chest, the coldness of it spreading through her. She had been nothing more than a tool to them in the past, and she knew she would always be seen that way, unless somehow she could prove her worth. The silence between Edward and his guests was thick with unspoken agreements, the kind of silence that only exists when power has already spoken. Maya stepped carefully around the marble columns, her eyes fixed on the ground, not daring to lift them. She was just one more face in a sea of people who would never notice her. The dinner was nearly over, and the conversation drifted from stock prices to charity galas, from business to fashion. Maya's throat tightened as she moved closer to the door, the sound of high heels clicking on the floor echoing in her ears. She caught the faintest glimpse of Edward's profile, his jawline sharp, his gaze distant. He didn't care about her or anyone like her. She wasn't a person here. She was just another part of the backdrop. The guests laughed again, their voices light, carefree, while Maya, standing in the periphery, couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to belong to a world that saw you as something more than invisible. The room was heavy with laughter as Edward stood at the head of the table, his guests leaning in to hear the latest deal he was closing. Maya stood in the corner, unnoticed, her tray heavy with untouched glasses of champagne. The conversation was light, filled with shallow pleasantries, until the tone shifted. Edward's voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the chatter. "We need to cut costs," he said, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his glass. "The employees are expendable. We'll hire cheaper labor." Maya felt a tight knot in her stomach, but she kept her eyes down. She had heard this kind of talk before. She had been the one to make the cut in his last project, the one who found the mistake. No one cared. The poor stayed poor and the rich made their own rules. But this felt different. This wasn't just about profits. It was about people's lives. As the others nodded in agreement, the weight of their indifference pressed on Maya's chest. She wasn't just a maid in this room. She was invisible. No one saw her. No one heard her. But she had to speak. She couldn't stay silent. The words came out before she could stop them, sharp and clear. "You can't just cut wages without considering the impact," Maya said, her voice trembling, but steady. The room fell silent. Edward's eyes snapped to her, his brows furrowed, a flash of confusion crossing his face. She had spoken. Maya swallowed hard. She had crossed the line. She was just the help. She wasn't supposed to have an opinion. She wasn't supposed to be seen. She took a step forward, her heartbeat loud in her ears. "Some of us are just trying to survive, not just make a profit," she continued, her words coming faster now. "The people you're talking about don't have a choice." The silence was deafening. The others at the table exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. They were too afraid to argue, too comfortable in their seats of power. Edward's expression darkened. "Maya," he said, his voice colder than she had ever heard it. "You're out of line." She froze but didn't step back. This could end her job. She knew it. She had nothing left to lose. "Sir, I don't mean to disrespect you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you're not the only one in this room who has to make hard choices." She could feel the eyes on her, cold, calculating. She had just shattered the unspoken rule of her place in this world. But it felt necessary. She wasn't invisible anymore. Edward stood still for a moment, his jaw tightening. The room seemed to lean in with anticipation. "You're fired," he said, his words cold, like a final sentence. The words sliced through the air, and for a second, Maya thought she might collapse. But she didn't. She stood there, holding his gaze, knowing what would come next. One of the women from the table, her eyes wide with discomfort, quickly spoke up. Maybe we can find a way to discuss this more." But Edward cut her off with a dismissive wave. "No," he said sharply. "I've heard enough." The tension in the room thickened. Maya could feel every eye on her now, every judgment, every whisper. She had crossed the line, and there would be consequences. Maya turned, her eyes still locked on Edward. "If you really think you can just replace everyone with cheaper labor, then I don't belong here," she said, her voice steady, but her stomach twisted with fear. The truth was there, but it didn't matter. He had already decided. She wasn't worth keeping around. As she moved toward the door, she felt the weight of the room pressing in on her. She could hear the whispers behind her. Some of them felt like they were meant for her, but most were about her. The other guests didn't care. The rich rarely cared. They always had a way to replace the things they didn't need. Maya walked out into the hallway, the cold air hitting her like a slap. Her mind raced. She had lost her job. She had broken the rules of the rich. But she had said something. She had made them listen, even if they didn't care. She had fought for something more than just survival. She had fought for respect. It didn't matter what happened next. The choice had been hers, and she wouldn't take it back. As the door clicked shut behind her, the room inside fell back into its usual rhythm, until Edward's voice echoed again, colder than ever. "Get her out of here." Maya's heart pounded in her chest as she stood there, her fingers gripping the doorframe. The sharpness in Edward's voice still rang in her ears. "You're fired." Those words had never felt so final. But it wasn't the words that cut the deepest. It was the cold indifference behind them. Her breath came faster now, colder than the chill in the air around her. The door to the grand dining room slammed shut behind her, the sound like the end of something that could never be repaired. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She wanted to leave, run away from the suffocating silence, from the burning sting of humiliation. Her pulse raced as her footsteps echoed down the hallway, each one louder than the last, as if the house itself were mocking her. She could hear their voices behind her, too quiet to make out, but the whispers were there. Her head spun as the reality of the situation crashed down on her. She had gone too far. She had spoken when she wasn't supposed to. She had defied them. But why did it feel like she was the one who had been wronged? Why did it feel like her world was crumbling, while they all went on, untouched, their lives unshaken? A few steps away, she heard the sound of high heels clicking on the marble floor. She turned sharply, and there was Veronica, the head of housekeeping, her face tight with discomfort. "Maya," she said softly, but there was no kindness in her voice, no empathy. Maya's throat closed up. She didn't want to hear this. She didn't want to hear any more of their excuses. She didn't want to be told that she had misunderstood, that she had made a mistake, that she was the problem. "You should have known better," Veronica continued, her eyes shifting uneasily. "You can't just, I didn't do anything wrong." Maya cut her off, her voice tight, but there was a fire in her chest now. She wasn't going to apologize. She wasn't going to back down. Veronica flinched, stepping back, as though Maya's words had physically struck her. But she didn't stop. "This is how things work here. You don't just, I didn't ask for any of this," Maya snapped. Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. "I didn't ask to be invisible. I didn't ask to be ignored. And I didn't ask to be treated like I was nothing. The silence between them grew thick, suffocating. Maya could feel her hands trembling, her body shaking with the weight of the words she had just said. She wasn't angry anymore. She was exhausted. "And now you've made yourself a target," Veronica said, her voice quieter now, but there was no kindness in it. "People will remember this. You don't know what you've done." Maya's chest tightened. "I spoke up," she said, her voice breaking. "I told the truth." "That's not the truth," Veronica replied, her eyes avoiding Maya's. "This is a business. You can't—" "I don't care about your business," Maya spat. The words were out before she could stop them, and she immediately regretted it. But it was too late. The damage had been done. She turned away, her pulse racing, her head spinning. She couldn't stay here. Not like this. But before she could walk away, a voice called out from behind her, stopping her in her tracks. "Maya!" She froze. It was Edward. His voice was sharp, commanding. She didn't turn around. She couldn't. She didn't want to face him. "Turn around," he demanded. His voice was cold, colder than it had ever been. Maya's body stiffened, but she slowly, reluctantly, faced him. Edward stood at the top of the grand staircase, his expression unreadable, his eyes piercing, cold, like two knives pointed at her. "You made a mistake," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Maya swallowed hard, her hands trembling at her sides. She wasn't going to beg for her job back. She wasn't going to apologize. She wouldn't. "I didn't make a mistake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did what was right." Edward's lips curled into something between a sneer and a grin. "You think you did what was right?" His voice was slow, mocking. "You're nothing but a maid. You have no right to lecture me or anyone in this house." Maya felt the sting of his words, but she didn't flinch. She couldn't. "Your opinion doesn't matter," he continued, his words becoming sharper. "You think you can just speak out and change everything? You have no idea what you've done." Her chest tightened as the words hit her like fists. They were meant to break her, to remind her of her place, to remind her that no matter how loud she screamed, she would never be heard. But she wasn't going to let him break her. Not again. "I'm not a maid," Maya said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm not invisible, and I will not be silenced." Edward's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing. "You're nothing more than a tool to keep things running smoothly, and now you've overstepped. You've ruined it all." "I haven't ruined anything," Maya shot back, her heart racing. "You've built a system where people like me don't matter. You've built a world where people are only as valuable as what they can do for you." Edward's face tightened. "That's enough." But Maya couldn't stop. "No," she said, stepping forward, her voice shaking with fury. "That's not enough. I'm done being invisible. I'm done pretending that I'm nothing." The tension in the air thickened, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Edward didn't speak. His jaw was clenched, his eyes flashing with anger. And then, in a sharp motion, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Maya stood frozen in the silence that followed, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The sting of his words still burned in her chest. But there was something else, too. Something deep inside her that told her she had done the right thing. Even if it cost her everything. Even if she lost it all. She wasn't going to be invisible anymore. And that was the only truth she needed. Maya stepped outside, the cold air hitting her like a wave. The snow had stopped falling, but the world was still blanketed in white, the silence pressing down on everything. Her breath hung in the air, drifting like smoke. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold onto some warmth, but the cold seemed to seep into her bones. She didn't know where she was going, but it didn't matter. The night stretched on ahead of her, empty and endless. She walked slowly, the crunch of her boots in the snow the only sound, and it felt like the world was holding its breath with her. The mansion loomed behind her, dark and silent now, a place she had never truly belonged. The lights inside had dimmed, leaving only shadows in the windows. She had thought she would feel relief once she walked away, but instead, it was like a weight had settled in her chest. Not a bad weight, just a heavy, quiet one. Her mind drifted back to the conversation with Edward. His words still stung, but now they felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. She had fought back, but what did it really mean? Was it worth it? She had said everything she needed to, but why did it feel like she was still stuck, like she was standing in the same place she had always been? Maya stopped at the edge of the driveway, looking up at the vast expanse of sky above her. The stars were faint, swallowed by the light from the mansion behind her, but they were still there, distant, cold, and unreachable. She had always liked the stars. They made her feel small, but not in the way people often think. It wasn't a crushing smallness. It was the kind of smallness that made you realize how much bigger everything else was. There was comfort in that. Comfort in knowing that your struggles were just part of a much bigger world. One that you could never fully understand, no matter how hard you tried. A gust of wind blew through the trees, and she shivered, pulling her coat tighter around herself. The cold wasn't new. It had always been there, lurking in the corners of her life. She had grown used to it, the chill of the world, the coldness of people, the quiet isolation. It had never stopped her before, but tonight it felt different. It wasn't the anger or the defiance that had driven her forward. It was something quieter, something deeper. A need to be seen, to matter, to not be forgotten. She had taken a step tonight, a step toward something she couldn't name, but something that felt real. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind, to the stillness of the night. The world felt infinite in these moments, bigger than her, bigger than all of them. But still, there was something inside her, something stubborn, that refused to let her disappear. She opened her eyes again and turned back toward the mansion. The lights still flickered faintly through the windows, but there was nothing warm about them now. She didn't want to go back inside. She didn't want to face what had happened or what was coming next. But she didn't have to. The night was hers, the air was hers, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't need permission to exist. Not from anyone. She stood there for a moment, the cold wind pulling at her hair, her breath steady in the air. And for the first time, she felt like she might be able to breathe again. The stars above were small, but they were still there. And in that vast, silent sky, she was just as important as they were. It had been 2 days since Maya left the mansion, and the world felt strange. Her body had become familiar with the cold again. The city's noise, the constant shuffle of people moving in their own worlds, barely noticing her. But there was something different in her chest, a restless energy she couldn't shake off. She was waiting for something she couldn't quite name, but she could feel it coming. It was late afternoon when the call came. She was walking down the street, the weight of the phone in her pocket almost unbearable. She hadn't expected to hear from them, especially not from Edward. She didn't know why he'd bother. Maybe he was looking for someone to blame, someone to throw under the bus for the mess she had made in his precious world. Maybe he just needed a reminder of who was really in control. But when the phone buzzed in her pocket, she felt it. A knot in her stomach, tightening as she reached for it. "Hello, Ms. Williams." The voice was unfamiliar, but polite, almost too polite. "This is Veronica from Hawthorne Enterprises. Mr. Hawthorne would like to speak with you." Maya's heart skipped. She paused on the sidewalk, the noise of the street fading into the background. Edward. She hadn't expected this. She should have said no, should have hung up and kept walking, but something in her made her stay. "Is this about my job?" Maya asked, her voice tight, unsure of where this was going. "No, Ms. Williams," Veronica said, her tone suddenly softer. "It's about something else. Could you please come by the office tomorrow? Mr. Hawthorne wants to meet with you personally." Maya didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure if she could trust this, if this was just another one of their games. But she had to know. "Fine," she said, her voice steady. "I'll be there." The next day, Maya stood at the entrance of Hawthorne Enterprises, her hands in her coat pockets, eyes scanning the marble floors and glass walls that stretched endlessly upward. Everything here screamed power, control, wealth, but none of it had the warmth she had imagined. It was cold, sterile. No one spoke to her as she passed them, and no one looked up from their work. She was just a shadow in the middle of it all. The receptionist led her to an elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. The ride felt too long, the silence too thick. When the doors finally opened, the same cold, polished world greeted her. The office was expansive, modern. Everything about it screamed authority. Edward stood by the window, his back to her, his hands behind him as he stared out over the city. He didn't turn when she entered. Maya stood there, waiting, the weight of the silence pressing on her. "Close the door." Edward's voice finally broke through the stillness, low and calm, but carrying an edge that made her stomach tighten. Maya did as he asked, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what was happening. When she turned around, he was facing her now, his posture stiff. His eyes were colder than she remembered, but there was something else in them now, something different. He was studying her, really seeing her for the first time. "You've been busy," he said, his voice quieter than before. Maya frowned, unsure of what he meant. "What do you mean?" Edward stepped forward, his hands now resting on the back of a chair. He didn't look like the same man who had dismissed her 2 days ago. There was something almost hesitant in his gaze. "Do you know what I've been doing these past 2 days?" he asked, his voice just a touch sharper. "No," Maya replied, her throat dry. She couldn't make sense of any of this. "I've been reviewing the numbers," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. "The investment you mentioned, the one I almost made? I had our team go through the documents you pointed out." Maya blinked, caught off guard. What did they find? Edward's jaw tightened. "You were right." He paused, almost as if the words were painful for him to say. "The entire deal was a trap. I almost signed on to something that would have ruined us." Maya's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. He was admitting it, admitting that she had been right all along. He took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "How did you know?" Maya swallowed. I saw the mistake. I've seen it before. I couldn't let you make it." Edward didn't speak for a moment. The silence between them stretched out, thick with unspoken things. And then he said something that stopped Maya's breath. "You saved us," he said, his voice low. "You saved the company. You saved me." Maya didn't know what to say. The words were too heavy. She had never imagined this, never imagined that her decision to speak up would lead to something like this. "But I never saw you," Edward continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never saw what you could do, what you really are. I underestimated you." Maya didn't respond. She couldn't. There was too much to process, too much to understand. Edward stepped back, his gaze hardening again. But there was something else in it now. Respect. "You've earned more than just my respect, Maya. You've earned a place here, whether you want it or not." She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The twist was clear now, but it didn't feel like a victory. Felt different. Edward had recognized her. He had finally seen her for what she was. But now the power had shifted. He was the one who had been wrong, not her. Maya took a deep breath, the weight of it all settling into her chest. She wasn't sure where this would go, but she knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same again. The game had changed, and now it was her turn to decide how to play. Maya sat in the small cafe across the street from the office, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, the warmth barely reaching her fingers. The world outside was still cold, the city buzzing with the usual noise, but everything felt different now. She wasn't sure what had changed exactly. Maybe it was the simple act of breathing in a moment of peace, away from all the power struggles, away from the tension. She had expected this day to be a whirlwind, a fight for validation, for an apology. But it wasn't like that. Instead, it was quieter, calmer. She hadn't heard from Edward since that meeting, and she hadn't expected to. He had said his piece, and now everything was in her hands. Maya wasn't the kind of person to seek revenge, to demand recognition. She had always understood the quiet power of simply standing your ground. She had learned that the hard way long before this moment. The door to the cafe opened, the bell above it ringing softly. Maya didn't look up at first. She didn't need to, but when the footsteps approached her table, she knew who it was. Edward's voice, low but steady, reached her ears. "May I sit?" She lifted her eyes slowly, not surprised. He looked different, more human, less like the man who had dismissed her without a second thought. His posture was different too. Not the cold, unapproachable billionaire, but someone more open, less guarded. Maya nodded, gesturing to the empty seat across from her. He sat down, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was just a pause, a moment where words weren't needed. Finally, Edward spoke, his voice softer than usual. "I've been thinking about what you said, about how I treated you, how I treated everyone in that place." Maya said nothing, letting him speak. She had learned long ago that sometimes the best thing you could do was listen. "I was wrong," he continued, the weight of the words hanging in the air. "You were right, and I should have seen that before." He took a breath, a slow, deep one, like he was gathering the courage to say something harder. "I underestimated you. I thought people like you were just background. I didn't see the real value in what you brought. I'm sorry." Maya's chest tightened, but she didn't show it. She wasn't going to break down. She wasn't going to let the apology define her. She had been waiting for something. Maybe not an apology, but a moment like this. A moment where the scales had finally tipped, not in her favor, but in the right direction. "I'm not looking for an apology," Maya said quietly. "I never was." Edward looked at her, his brow furrowed. "Then what do you want, Maya?" She took a slow sip of her coffee, her fingers warm around the cup. "I want to be seen, not just by you but by everyone. I want my actions to speak for themselves. That's all." Edward nodded slowly like he understood. He looked away for a moment, his gaze distant, but there was something in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. "You've changed how I see things," he said after a beat. "I'll be making changes. I'll be doing things differently, not just in the office but in how I treat people." "You were right about that." Maya didn't need to hear anything more. She didn't need to be told she was right. She didn't need him to fix anything. What mattered was that he saw it, that he finally understood. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet, "but I'm not here to change you. I'm here to do what's right." Edward seemed to absorb her words, his gaze softening. There was no smugness in his expression, no sense of entitlement. Just a man who had realized something and, for once, it seemed like it mattered. Maya stood up slowly, her body still aching from the weight of everything. But there was a lightness in her step that hadn't been there before. She didn't need to stay here, didn't need to hear him say anything more. She had already made her peace with the world. As she turned to leave, she heard his voice again. "Maya!" She paused but didn't turn around. "Yes, I meant what I said, about changing. I'll make it right, in my own way." Maya nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at her lips. "I hope you do," she said, and with that, she walked out the door, the cold air biting at her face. But it didn't matter anymore. She had already won. Maya stepped into the street, the evening sky stretching overhead, a faint orange glow fading into the dark. The city was quiet, the hum of life muted beneath a thin layer of snow. Her breath misted in the cold, hanging in the air before disappearing into the night. She didn't look back. The cafe door clicked shut behind her, the faintest echo of movement left in the glass. She walked down the sidewalk, her pace steady but unhurried. The world around her seemed distant, the lights of the city flickering like stars, out of reach. A gust of wind swept through the alley, swirling the snow around her feet, but she didn't flinch. The light from the street lamp caught the edges of her coat, a soft halo in the dim. She moved forward, each step purposeful but silent, the weight of the day lifting slowly with each breath. The sound of her boots in the snow was the only thing left, steady, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the world itself. The distance between her and the mansion grew, the towering structure fading into the night, until it was nothing but a shadow in the distance. And Maya kept walking, the night enveloping her, until she was swallowed whole by the quiet of the city.